I shouldn't have been standing there, not really, but the smell of motor oil and warm coffee pulled me in like gravity. The repair shop was quiet this Tuesday morning, just the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional clink of a wrench somewhere back in the garage. I had my notebook tucked under my arm, pretending I was here for work, but really I was watching her. She was leaning against the counter, half turned toward the sunlight streaking through the grimy windows. Her hair caught the light in a way that made me want to reach out and trace each silver thread like it meant something. She looked complete, like she owned the air around her and the world didn't even get a vote. And yet, when her gaze flicked toward me, there was this flash, quick, almost invisible, but it made my stomach flip. "Did you find it?" she asked, not looking at me directly. Her voice was low, calm, but there was a softness there, like she'd accidentally let someone behind the curtain. I nodded too quickly, wishing I could hide the flutter in my chest. "Yeah, I think so. You were right about the, circuit thing." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. She straightened, crossing her arms, but it wasn't defensive. It was deliberate, like she knew I was nervous and she liked that tiny, brittle part of me. I wanted to talk more, to say something clever, something that would make her laugh or at least glance at me in that way again. But the words died in my throat. Instead, I watched the way she moved, graceful without trying, confident without need. The kind of presence that made a room feel smaller and bigger at the same time. Then, almost like she sensed my frozen hesitation, she leaned closer, not in a way that screamed forward, but close enough that I could smell her perfume, faintly citrus, faintly something warmer I couldn't name. And she whispered, barely audible over the buzz of the lights, "Just feel me, not her." The words hit me like a spark in a damp room. Not shocking, not in a way I could immediately label, but electric. My heart stuttered, my palms itched to do something, anything, but I stayed still. She straightened almost instantly, like she hadn't said anything at all, and my notebook slipped from my hands without me noticing. I bent to pick it up, trying not to imagine the brush of her fingers against mine if she reached for it first. When I looked up again, she was walking toward the garage doors, rolling a wrench in her hands, humming a tune I couldn't place. The sunlight caught the curve of her neck and the tilt of her shoulder, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I didn't follow. I didn't speak. But I could feel that tiny charge lingering between us, stubborn and uninvited. Her shadow stretched long across the concrete floor, and I swear every time she moved, it carried a hint of something I couldn't name, but wanted to. I walked out of the repair shop later that morning, my notebook clutched like a talisman, replaying her words over and over. "Just feel me, not her." I didn't understand it, didn't want to, at least not yet, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I had a feeling I never would. If you want, I can tweak this to make the tension even slower burning, with more subtle micro-behaviors and silent glances that linger across the scene, making the story's first spark feel almost unbearable. Do you want me to do that next? I found myself back at the repair shop that afternoon, under the pretense of helping out. She hadn't asked for it. Of course, she never did. But when she glanced at me with that sharp, controlled gaze, I knew she was testing whether I'd actually show up. The rain had started mid-evening, drumming lightly against the hotel's glass doors. The lobby smelled of damp coats and faint coffee, but all I could notice was her. She was perched on a chair near the window, legs crossed, her hands wrapped around a mug like it could hold the calm she wouldn't let herself feel. I leaned against the counter, pretending to sort through papers I didn't need to touch. Every few seconds, my eyes wandered back to her. She'd tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, fingers lingering a little too long at her jawline. That small motion, so ordinary, so deliberate, made my chest tighten in a way I didn't fully understand. "Do you want some?" I asked, nodding at the mug. She glanced at me, eyes narrowing just slightly. Then she shook her head. "No thanks. I'll manage." Her tone was calm, but her fingers fidgeted around the rim. The slightest tremor. We stayed like that, silent, the storm outside painting the room in streaks of light and shadow. I wanted to say something, anything that might bridge the space between us, but I couldn't. I wasn't sure I could. So I kept still, breathing quietly, feeling every inch of the distance that shouldn't exist but somehow did. Then her phone buzzed, sharp and intrusive. She glanced at the screen, eyebrows knitting together. I caught the way her lips pressed into a thin line, the way her hand shook ever so slightly as she set it back down. Whoever had called, whatever it was, it reminded me that there were rules here, boundaries I wasn't supposed to cross. But the thought only made me lean in closer in my own head. Funny, she muttered, almost to herself. How quiet it feels, even with all this noise outside. I nodded, pretending I understood what she meant. I didn't. Not fully. But the moment, her voice low, the room dim, her shoulders just a fraction slumped, pulled something taut in me. I wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to brush her hair from her face, wanted to close the distance entirely. I could see it in the way she shivered, or maybe it was just the storm. Our eyes met, longer than usual, and for a heartbeat I thought she might lean in. Her chest rose and fell quickly, eyes searching mine like she was testing the air. I held perfectly still, conscious of every micro-movement. Her lips parting slightly, the subtle tilt of her head, the faint scent of coffee and rain lingering around her. And then the moment fractured. A voice called from the hallway, sharp and too loud, breaking the fragile bubble. She flinched, and the spell was gone. She straightened, setting the mug down with deliberate precision, her face composed again. I didn't speak. I didn't move. But in that brief, suspended heartbeat, I knew something had almost shifted. A step too far, a whisper too close, a confession too heavy, but it didn't. Not yet. As she turned away, I felt the weight of the space between us more acutely than ever, the memory of her gaze lingering long after the sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. I wanted that moment to last, even as I knew it never could. She was crouched near the engine bay of a car, sleeves rolled up just past her elbows. Grease smudged her fingers, a few streaks on her cheek. I wanted to tell her to let me do it, wanted to step forward and erase every trace of worry from her face, but I didn't. I stayed a step behind, careful, observing. You missed a bolt, I said quietly, hoping it sounded casual. She didn't look at me at first, just paused, wiping a hand across her forehead. Her shoulders tensed, but only slightly. Then, almost reluctantly, she laughed. It wasn't loud or careless. It was low and breathy, almost embarrassed. My chest tightened at the sound. You're persistent, she muttered, and there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, something she didn't hand out freely. A crack in the armor. I knelt beside her, careful not to get too close, and handed her the wrench she'd dropped. Our fingers brushed, quick, almost accidental, but enough to send a quiet jolt up my arm. She froze, eyes flicking to mine, and then away. I caught the faintest tremor in her hands. She looked tired, really tired, like the world had been asking too much of her, and she'd been quietly carrying it all alone. I'm sorry, she said after a moment, voice soft, almost swallowed by the noise of the shop. I shouldn't have asked for help. Her hesitation hung in the air between us. Not a refusal exactly, but not a clear acceptance either. It was fragile, tentative. I didn't respond with words. I just nodded, letting her know I was here, letting her hold that moment however long she needed. She exhaled sharply and rolled her shoulders back, forcing her focus back to the engine. But I noticed the small things. The way her hair fell across her cheek, the faint tremor in her fingers as she gripped the wrench, the way she barely glanced at me even though she wanted to. There was trust buried in that tension, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, I felt it. The sun shifted in the dusty windows, casting stripes of light over her. I imagined tracing them along her arms, over her shoulders, over her hands. The ones I had barely touched but wanted to know entirely. She didn't flinch at my glance, didn't smile or acknowledge the thought I wasn't trying to hide. She just kept working, precise, controlled, but human. I wanted to say something, anything, but the word stuck. Instead, I handed her a rag to wipe her hands, and our fingers brushed again, lingering a fraction too long to be accidental. She looked up at me then, and her eyes softened, just a little, but the softening was enough to pull me in deeper. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible exchange, I realized how fragile the space between us was, how easily it could be stretched, pulled, or broken. I didn't move closer. I didn't speak. I just watched her, captivated, and for a second longer than I should, I wanted nothing more than to reach across and close the distance entirely. The rain had started mid-evening, drumming lightly against the hotel's glass doors. The lobby smelled of damp coats and faint coffee, but all I could notice was her. She was perched on a chair near the window, legs crossed, her hands wrapped around a mug like it could hold the calm she wouldn't let herself feel. I leaned against the counter, pretending to sort through papers I didn't need to touch. Every few seconds, my eyes wandered back to her. She'd tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, fingers lingering a little too long at her jawline. That small motion, so ordinary, so deliberate, made my chest tighten in a way I didn't fully understand. "Do you want some?" I asked, nodding at the mug. She glanced at me, eyes narrowing just slightly. Then she shook her head. "No, thanks. I'll manage." Her tone was calm, but her fingers fidgeted around the rim. The slightest tremor. We stayed like that, silent, the storm outside painting the room in streaks of light and shadow. I wanted to say something, anything that might bridge the space between us, but I couldn't. I wasn't sure I could. So I kept still, breathing quietly, feeling every inch of the distance that shouldn't exist but somehow did. Then her phone buzzed, sharp and intrusive. She glanced at the screen, eyebrows knitting together. I caught the way her lips pressed into a thin line, the way her hand shook ever so slightly as she set it back down. Whoever had called, whatever it was, it reminded me that there were rules here, boundaries I wasn't supposed to cross, but the thought only made me lean in closer in my own head. "Funny," she muttered, almost to herself. "How quiet it feels, even with all this noise outside." I nodded, pretending I understood what she meant. I didn't. Not fully. But the moment, her voice low, the room dim, her shoulders just a fraction slumped, pulled something taut in me. I wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to brush her hair from her face, wanted to close the distance entirely. I could see it in the way she shivered, or maybe it was just the storm. Our eyes met, longer than usual, and for a heartbeat I thought she might lean in. Her chest rose and fell quickly, eyes searching mine like she was testing the air. I held perfectly still, conscious of every micro-movement. Her lips parting slightly, the subtle tilt of her head, the faint scent of coffee and rain lingering around her. And then the moment fractured. A voice called from the hallway, sharp and too loud, breaking the fragile bubble. She flinched, and the spell was gone. She straightened, setting the mug down with deliberate precision, her face composed again. I didn't speak. I didn't move. But in that brief, suspended heartbeat, I knew something had almost shifted. A step too far, a whisper too close, a confession too heavy, but it didn't. Not yet. As she turned away, I felt the weight of the space between us more acutely than ever, the memory of her gaze lingering long after the sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. I wanted that moment to last, even as I knew it never could. I found her alone in the corner of the bookstore that evening, the lights dim, the rain outside painting the shelves in blurry streaks. She was crouched by a stack of old novels, flipping through the pages as though each one held a secret she wasn't ready to share. I stayed at the end of the aisle, pretending to browse, though every fiber of me wanted to close the distance. She looked up, startled, just slightly, but didn't move. Her eyes held that same weight I'd been chasing for weeks, that quiet intensity that made me feel exposed even though I wasn't doing anything. I don't know what this is anymore," she said finally, voice low, almost swallowed by the quiet hum of the bookstore. I froze. The words were ordinary, but the way she said them, the hesitation, the barely audible catch in her breath, made it feel like a confession. I didn't answer, not yet. I just let her words hang between us, heavy and unshakable. She stood slowly, adjusting the scarf around her neck, and for a moment I noticed how tired she looked, how carefully she tried to maintain control. "We can't just pretend, you know? This, whatever this is," she trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't come. I swallowed, trying to measure the distance between us, not just physically, but the one that had been growing quietly over weeks of stolen glances and near misses. I know, I finally said, barely above a whisper. I know it's complicated. Her lips pressed together, and she looked away. The silence stretched, a living thing, filling the gaps with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to reach out, wanted to tell her that I could handle the complication, that I didn't care about the rules, but something inside me stayed frozen. Something inside her, too. She turned back toward me, eyes glistening just enough to catch the light. I shouldn't even be here, she murmured. I shouldn't be letting myself. She stopped herself, hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Her fingers lingered near her jawline, and I noticed the subtle tremor. I stepped closer, careful, almost afraid. Then why are you? She didn't answer immediately. The pause was unbearable, filled with all the unspoken questions, the longing neither of us could admit, the tiny betrayals of our own hearts. Finally, she exhaled sharply, like letting air out of a balloon. I don't know. The bookstore smelled faintly of paper and rain. My chest ached, my hands itched to reach for her, but I didn't. I stayed just far enough to not cross a line, but close enough that the air between us felt electric, raw, like standing on a cliff's edge and knowing the fall might be inevitable. She looked down at the floor, then back at me, voice breaking just slightly. Maybe I'm scared. Or maybe I've been pretending for so long that I don't even know what I want anymore. I wanted to hold her, to tell her it was okay, that none of this had to make sense. But instead, I simply nodded, heart thudding, eyes locked on hers. And then, almost inaudible, she whispered, I think I'm already too far gone. I didn't expect her to open up that evening. The cafe was nearly empty, chairs stacked along the far wall, the smell of roasted coffee beans thick in the warm air. We were sitting across from each other at the small table by the window, rain tracing streaks down the glass, and I could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing between us. She stirred her drink slowly, eyes fixed on the swirling liquid. It's been a long time since I let anyone in, she said, voice soft, almost brittle. I didn't move, didn't interrupt, just let her find the words herself. I lost someone, she continued, a flicker of something raw and unguarded in her gaze. Not just anyone. My first love. My husband. He wasn't perfect, but he mattered. And then one day, he wasn't there anymore. Her hands wrapped around the mug as if it could keep the memory from spilling out. I swallowed hard, trying to measure how close I could get without breaking whatever fragile barrier she had left. I stopped. I didn't know what to say, and I think she was glad. Silence can be kinder than clumsy words. She glanced up, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself look tired. Really tired. I don't think anyone realizes how heavy it gets, carrying someone who's gone. You try not to think about it, but it sneaks in anyway. I nodded. My mind wandered to the photo I'd accidentally seen once, tucked behind a frame on her desk, a younger version of her, laughing with a man whose absence I could almost feel in the room. I wanted to tell her that I'd seen it, that I remembered the way she paused when she looked at it, but instead I reached for her hand. Tentatively, hesitantly. Her fingers brushed mine, light as a feather, and she didn't pull away. She didn't smile, either. There was just acknowledgement, recognition, a quiet shared understanding that went deeper than any words. I think that's why she paused, voice trembling ever so slightly. I'm scared. I let people in, and then they leave. Or I leave them. And I don't know if I could handle it again. I squeezed her hand gently, trying to communicate everything I couldn't say aloud. That it was okay. That I wasn't going anywhere. That maybe some things, some moments, weren't about replacing the past, but simply existing with it. Her eyes flicked down to our hands, then back up at mine. For a second, she looked vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before, exposed, human, alive. The faintest quiver of a breath escaped her lips, almost imperceptible, yet it shook the air between us. And then she whispered, almost to herself, almost to the rain outside. I never thought I'd let anyone feel this close again. I wanted to tell her that I felt it too, that I'd been pulled in from the first glance, the first spark, but I didn't. I just stayed there, hand in hers, listening to the quiet storm in her chest. And that, I realized, was enough to make everything feel seismic. We ended up at the small park near her apartment, late afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of damp leaves and the faint warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds. Neither of us spoke at first. I could feel her beside me on the bench, close enough to notice the way her shoulder grazed mine, the faint rhythm of her breath against the fabric of my sleeve. She glanced at me once, eyes soft, guarded, and I knew she was weighing the same thing I was. How far we'd let ourselves come without naming it, without breaking the fragile tension that had carried us this far. "You're hard to read," she said finally, voice low, a little teasing, but not really. Her fingers brushed mine as she shifted, just slightly, and I felt the spark in that small, careless contact. "I could say the same," I replied, and the words felt honest in a way that no grand declaration ever could. We sat together, shoulders touching, hands occasionally brushing, sharing a quiet rhythm that had nothing to do with speech. The park was almost empty, save for a couple of distant joggers and a dog barking far off, but it felt like we were in our own little world. I noticed the way her hair caught the sunlight, the soft lines around her eyes, the way her lips pressed together when she concentrated on something I couldn't see. She leaned back slightly, resting her head on the bench, and I didn't move away. The proximity wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gentle, inevitable, something we had both arrived at without realizing the path we'd taken. "I didn't think. I wasn't sure this could happen," she murmured, almost to herself. Her hand found mine deliberately this time, and we didn't let go. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a confirmation that we were both here, both present, both willing. I wanted to say more, to try to capture the weight of everything between us, but I didn't. Silence felt enough. It was enough. She shifted slightly again, tilting her head toward me, a quiet invitation, and I leaned just enough for my forehead to rest lightly against hers. Our breaths mingled, and the tension, the uncertainty, all of the longing and fear and restraint collapsed into a single, fragile moment. No words could improve it. No confessions, no promises, no dramatic declarations. Just two people acknowledging what had quietly become undeniable, two hearts settling into the same unspoken truth. And in that quiet park, surrounded by the soft hum of the city and the faint rustle of leaves, I realized that nothing needed to be said. Our connection had always been here, woven into glances, silences, and the smallest touches. Now it was simply ours to inhabit. We sat like that for a long while, hands entwined, foreheads touching, letting the world exist around us without needing to intrude. There was no rush, no fanfare, no curtain call, just the soft, unspoken acknowledgement that we had arrived somewhere inevitable and somehow entirely earned. And when she finally leaned her head fully against my shoulder, I closed my eyes, letting the quiet finality of it settle over us, like a soft exhale we had both been holding for far too long. Sitting in my apartment now, a few weeks later, I keep replaying the quiet afternoons, the stormy evenings, the small moments that never seemed like much at the time, but meant everything. It's strange how life changes in the spaces between words, in the brush of fingers, in silences that speak louder than any confession. She's different now, too. I can tell, even in the brief texts or the way she laughs across a shared coffee table. There's a softness in her presence that wasn't there before, a willingness to let someone in without fear of losing herself. Not that she's changed completely. She's still sharp, still confident. But the walls she carried so carefully have shifted, just enough for us to exist in the same space without stepping on the edges of each other's scars. And me? I've learned patience, the way desire and respect can coexist, how watching someone closely can teach you more about yourself than rushing toward what you think you want. I've learned that sometimes love isn't about fireworks or declarations. It's about the quiet persistence of being present, noticing, and valuing the small, fragile things about another person. We both learned that intimacy isn't a single moment. It's the accumulation of countless almost moments, gestures, hesitations, and choices. And maybe that's the kind of love that lasts. Not perfect, not dramatic, but undeniable in its simplicity. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at the memory of her leaning against the counter at the repair shop, or the way her eyes softened when she whispered about her past heartbreak. Other times, it's the subtle brush of our hands on the park bench, a quiet affirmation that we were both willing to step into something uncertain. The world hasn't changed, bills, responsibilities, traffic, but it feels different when she's in it. Everything has its own rhythm now, a quiet intimacy woven into the ordinary. That's the afterglow I didn't expect, the one that lingers long after the initial spark has faded. The knowledge that we're here, together, with all our flaws and history intact, and it's enough. And that's what matters. Not a grand finale, not a sweeping declaration, just the presence of someone who sees you, who lets themselves be seen, and the decision to stay anyway. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?